Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Now this is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Peter Ndoro and this is what's coming up on the show today. Well, as the world continues to attempt to bring down the number of COVID-19 infections, more and more people are seeking information around the virus. And with Africa touted as the continent that will be hard hit by the virus, if not contained, we take a closer look at how African journalism is reporting on this pandemic. In our international editor feature this week, well, it takes us to the West African country of Nigeria, and we're also hoping to go to Namibia to get an update on how the media is telling the COVID-19 story in those countries. Now, in our News in History feature, we take you back to the 2nd of April 2018. And that's, of course, when the mother of the nation, Winnie Mandela, passed on. We'll go back to find out how we told that story at that time. That's the show. Remember, you can engage with us on social media using the Twitter handle, #SABC Media Monitor, #SABC Media Monitor. But before we get into our highlighted stories on the program, let's first take a look at what's on the front pages of today's newspapers. And we start with the Sunday Times. And the Sunday Times leads with a story about the COVID-19 coronavirus house-to-house screening that's currently underway, with fears from experts that we may have a false picture of the situation on the ground. A possible COVID-19 infection spike could overwhelm the country's health services. The City Press headline, well, that says stay at home and avoid trouble. Yeah, the Police Minister Bekitele has warned against fake videos and is pulling no punches when it comes to alcohol prohibition laws, saying that they should actually remain even after the lockdown. The Sunday Independent is reporting that small, medium and micro enterprises, SMMEs, are accusing government of excluding them from the COVID-19 related business rescue funds, all in favour of politically connected entrepreneurs. They say that the 21-day lockdown is a massacre for SMMEs. Right, let's take a look at the Weekend Argus on Sunday, and that's telling the story of a pediatric nurse in Cape Town, in one of the largest private hospitals there, that's been hospitalized after she tested positive for COVID-19. Apparently, the 55-year-old had been going to work unaware that she had contracted the virus. It's believed that she got the virus from a close relative who had traveled back from Turkey. And the Sunday Tribune, well, that's also reporting on COVID-19 pandemic, describing the next steps being taken against this new coronavirus. Government has rolled out its tracing, home screening and testing program in keeping with the pledge that made President Cyril Ramaphosa for a large-scale medical management program. And the Sunday World, well, that headline speaks about the COVID-19 coronavirus hitting vulnerable citizens living in shacks who, because of their cramped circumstances, are finding it impossible to adhere to the call for social distancing. This as the country starts a scramble for COVID-19 beds. All right, so that's the front pages of the print media. Let's take a look at what captured your attention on social media, the platform Twitter. And a short while ago, these were the top trends in South Africa. And as you can see, and understandably, I guess, day 10 of the lockdown, we've got vaccine, Bill Gates at number 4, and apparently he's spending a lot of money developing the most likely, what he's promising, vaccines. But these will take about a year to come out, so we're only expecting those to come out in the next year. But the one that's really fascinated me is this day 10 of the lockdown. Let's take a look at some of the messages that have been coming through. People saying a few words, you know, good morning family, seeing you're at church and fellowship. So again, messages of day 10, how people spending those days. And there we've got people praying on the street, and a word of prayer there from Powerhouse Speaker. And then the next one, let's take a look at this message. That was the last one, all right. Okay, so a lot of messages and people sharing their thoughts, but one that's pretty controversial. I don't know if you've seen it. Musician Zahara has been singing, and she's singing the national anthem, and it looks like she was enjoying herself. And so get onto social media, Twitter, put in Zahara, and you'll see her in full song. Okay, so more. Let's a lot still to come. Stay with us. So, more and more in recent years, we've seen a number of print publications forced to close as the digital era brought with it social media and other disruptions to the traditional business models that our newspapers and magazines survived on for decades. Well, a new disruptor, this time in the form of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, is causing them more damage to publications. Last week, one of the iconic newspapers in South Africa sent out a plea to South Africa for help. The paper said as the country went into the state disaster and then the 21-day national lockdown, advertisers, which contribute about 70% of their revenue, cancelled their campaigns. Their live events, which make up roughly 20% of their income, came to an abrupt halt. The paper says that with 90% of its income disrupted, it'll struggle to pay salaries next month. So it's reached out to the public asking for support to keep their 35-year-old publication going. Well, the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, has expressed its solidarity with all media entities that are facing difficult financial times. According to SANEF, it is aware that some media operations across the country are struggling to cope with the difficult financial environment, made worse, of course, by COVID-19 coronavirus, this pandemic. For more on this, I'm now joined via Skype by SANEF Executive Director Kate Skinner. Kate, thanks so much indeed for joining us on Media Monitor. Just reading that story about the Mail and Guardian, and this is not a small publication. If they're feeling the pinch, then there's a lot more smaller newspapers and publications that are really feeling the pressure because of COVID-19.
Absolutely, and we're very worried about that because I think that, before the coronavirus hit us, we were already as an industry in some distress in terms of finances, and so of course this is exacerbating the situation. And you're absolutely right. It's little publications that I think are going to really suffer. But also it's interesting. It seems that some of the very big media houses, such as Independent, for instance, are also saying that they might be cutting salaries up to possibly as much as 45%. So we're seeing it literally across the industry.
So cutting salaries is, I suppose, a lot more palatable than losing jobs entirely. And these are the difficult decisions that some of these publications are having to make.
Absolutely, and you're totally right. I mean, the thing is that what we want to do is ensure that journalists are still in the newsroom, and we've seen incredible numbers of retrenchments over the years. So you're right, it is a bit more palatable to have salary cuts, but still salary cuts themselves are really difficult because, I mean, particularly if they're large salary cuts, because, I mean, people have bonds to pay, school fees to pay, and those expenses don't go away.
Do you fear that the post-COVID-19 era is going to be so permanently disrupted that we're not going to see, we're going to have a completely different landscape in print and other media?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's so difficult to predict how things are going to pan out. But I think that is one of our serious worries, is that, a number of little publications might fold. Some of the bigger ones, might have to retrench staff. And, of course, that has an impact on quality journalism. So we're worried. We're definitely worried about what that environment will look like.
Do you know if government is going to help media houses with these packages that are being designed? Does the media fall into that?
So that's an interesting question. So what we do know is that the Media Development and Diversity Agency specifically has been targeting emergency grants at small publications, small commercial publications and community publications. So there has been money through the MDDA. But you're right, we have to look at the other funds that potentially could assist media operations. So we basically said a package of different things. Please, the general public, subscribe to publications. Also, please, advertisers continue to advertise. And as you're saying, also looking at other means of ensuring that funds come into media publications and media entities, including, of course, small radio stations.
Yeah. Have you, I suppose freelance journalists are possibly the most vulnerable because one just doesn't use them if, things get really bad. This must be a concern for SANEF?
It is absolutely, and it's actually interesting because we spent a lot of time, communicating with SAFRIA and with ProJourn, and those are two organizations that organize freelancers. And we've said to them, whichever ways we can possibly assist you, please tell us. Interestingly, for freelancers, there are international funds that have been set up. But of course, if South African journalists apply to that, they're competing with journalists from across the globe.
Yeah.
So, it's not that easy to get those kinds of funds. But we certainly have been reaching out to those organizations.
What sort of conversations have you been having with the communications minister, maybe, regarding the challenges that the media is facing at this stage?
So it's interesting. We've had a lot of different discussions with government, with GCIS, Government Communication Information System, and obviously with the Department of Communications. And in fact, a lot of it has been around kind of, practical issues of like what documents do journalists need to be out in the field because they're essential workers. We've had a lot of discussions about so-called fake news and false information and what to do about that. So a lot of the discussions have been very practical discussions about the kind of regulations and things. But the discussions about the finances of the media industry, we haven't actually got to yet, partly because of all the other sort of very practical issues around documentation, etc.
All right, let's talk a little bit about doing the job itself, because sadly we've been hearing incidents of perhaps the police and the army being heavy-handed, particularly when it comes to journalists. What have you been hearing?
Yeah, so I mean, that's one of the things that SANEF focuses on is safety of journalists. It's kind of one of our top priorities. And certainly right at the beginning of the lockdown, there were some very worrying incidents. I mean, there was a journalist, a News 24 journalist in Yeovil that was literally shot at with rubber bullets. And you can hear in the video the journalist shouting, stop, I'm from the media. It's very, very anxious, worried, call from the journalist. And then also a particular journalist in Cape Town had she was a photographer from the Argus, and she had her cell phone taken away. So she was trying to take photographs. And so we, as SANEF, then immediately spoke to the SAPs, and we said, look, you have got to make sure that this message is coming, is going down to the ground, that SAPs have to understand that journalists are part of essential services, and we have to be on the ground, and we have to be able to cover what's happening. The messages that we are receiving is that actually the security services are heeding our call to make sure that they protect journalists. And in fact, yesterday we heard quite a story about journalists in Ulundi, in fact an SABC News crew, and community members were threatening journalists that were doing stories in and around Ulundi. And in fact, the SAPs came to their defense. So they were actually playing a role of protecting journalists there. So I think things are improving, but of course, we've got to constantly be vigilant around what's happening.
All right, and I just wonder, have you seen the guidelines for journalists in terms of covering COVID-19, and what are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that overall, the regulations, they are actually quite good. I mean, I think the things that government has put out, but we also have put out, is responsible journalism, check facts. Absolutely essential that you go to credible sources. So, and also that we need to debunk, any kind of disinformation. So I think, and that's what government has been saying very strongly, and we as SANEF have been saying very strongly. And of course, the other component has been around safety of journalists, making sure that, no journalist with a compromised immunity system goes out. The journalists that don't want to go out should be respected and shouldn't have to go out on assignment. And of course, all the issues around protective gear, etc. So, I mean, all of those guidelines are out there, and SANEF has been supportive of them. The one thing that we've been a bit worried about is some of the regulations around, they're very strict around the spread of disinformation. I mean, you can get a jail sentence, and fines. And we've said, yes, we understand, obviously, that it's very problematic to put out disinformation, but we're just saying that it can only be for this particular lockdown period and not beyond, and not beyond coronavirus issues.
All right. And what have your editors been saying about protecting their own journalists from COVID-19? And I don't know, is there a testing process? Because you can carry it for a while. You go out there doing your work and you might be spreading it unknowingly.
Exactly. So no, we basically said to editors and to journalists, if you have gone out on assignment, you have to watch the symptoms very, very carefully, and particularly, looking at your temperature, taking your temperature regularly, but being very aware of the fact that you must constantly check that. And then, of course, if there are any symptoms at all, to immediately self-isolate, and of course, immediately tell your news organization and your editors. So you're quite right. It is worrying. We are on the front line, and the possibilities of us catching the virus are very high.
And perhaps one last question, talking about freelance journalists. When you get paid for working, it's very difficult for you to say, and perhaps, the greater good is I must stand down. But if you're paid to be out there and you're not getting paid if you're not out there, is there not a danger that we've got some freelancers who might suspect that they've got something but will go to work anyway because they need the money?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think the economics of the lockdown, of course, are really, really difficult. And so I think you're right that there might be certain circumstances where freelancers are so worried about their own finances that they say, I don't feel that well, but I'll still go out. The thing is that I think that what we're trying to say at SANEF and also the freelance organizations, please don't do that.
Yeah.
Please really do look after your health. And of course, for the long term, that is the only sensible thing to do.
All right. Kate Skinner, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for your insights this morning on Media Monitor. All right, that's Kate Skinner, as Executive Director of the South African National Editors Forum, sharing her thoughts with us about the challenges that media houses are facing in just staying alive, made worse, of course, by COVID-19. We'll have more for you right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor. Now, today is day 10 of South Africa's national COVID-19 lockdown, and as infection numbers continue to rise in Africa, questions are being raised about the media's coverage of the deadly virus across the continent. Well, to get a perspective on this, I'm now joined on the line from the UK by Associate Professor in Journalism at the University of Central Lancashire, George Ogola. Thanks so much for joining us. Good to have you on the program again. Let me start by just asking how the situation is in the UK. I mean, we've seen that infection rates and death rates sadly are rising.
It is. It's frightening. I think people are quite anxious, and rightly so. I think this is unprecedented. Nobody quite expected it to be as bad as it is. But we are hopeful that, over the next couple of weeks we'll turn the corner. Everybody is quite anxious about what's happening.
All right, I'm going to ask you how the media is covering the COVID-19 story there so that we can compare it to the story that's playing out in Africa. How has the media been with COVID-19 in the UK?
I think broadly, the narrative is very similar, to what's happening across Europe and the United States. It's all about sort of those specific interventions that have been advocated for by the World Health Organization, social distancing, self-isolation, the quarantines. And that's what's being, reproduced sort of across, the broad spectrum of media, whether be it broadcast or print. But they've also been largely supportive of the government's efforts to curb this virus, the spread of this virus. But equally, so just pointing out, the weaknesses. As you know, the UK has a very vibrant press. So they've also picked out, the weaknesses of the government plans. For example, when it comes to sort of the shutdown, they feel that it came a bit too late when they actually had plenty of time to have learned lessons from what happened in Italy and Spain.
All right, so let's now compare that and contrast with what's been happening on our continent. What's been your observations, by and large, of our media across the continent in the midst of this pandemic?
I think it's my view would be that it's mixed, really. I think we've got to recognize the difficulties of reporting this particular story. We've never had such sort of in our lifetime. So I think journalists across the continent are struggling with the reporting. Not to suggest that there haven't been sort of good informative stories. I think across the continent we've had some brilliant stories, human stories that actually put a human face to the numbers. But I also feel in the same vein that some of the reporting has also been quite problematic, not least because it simply sort of reproduced the narratives that we see across Europe. A case in point, for example, is sort of this domination of the news with the concepts of social isolation, social distancing rather, self-isolation, quarantines, concepts that work very well within the context of the Western world, but whose application in the context of Africa is hugely problematic. And I feel that the media has not problematized some of these issues to the extent that they've sort of fed into policy interventions that might not necessarily work. And I think that's where we need to reflect, perhaps as African journalism to see how that could have been done better.
All right. The state of press freedom is different across the continent, and we know what can happen when you have state media as the predominant voice in a country, and that perhaps that the media, instead of being more responsible and more critical, can be a mouthpiece of government and perhaps not telling the whole story.
I think there's truth in that. And we cannot sort of underestimate, the fear that journalists have in perhaps, contesting, state policy or state narratives. But, we've got millions at risk, and I think it's still responsible of African journalism to not necessarily undermine the risks, but collectively, ensure that the state actually looks at what's at risk here. If, for example, the World Health Organization says, well, this is a disease that makes, for example, the elderly, quite vulnerable. But when you look at the demographic of Africa, for example, you realize that, only, 6% of the population are over 65. And so that, the population is quite youthful. I don't think it would be, it's very difficult for African journalists to focus on this sort of 65%, what makes them vulnerable? We know about, for example, the communicable diseases, in Africa is huge. The disease burden of sort of TB, HIV, malaria, these are critical issues that make our populations very vulnerable. And I think it should have been sort of incumbent upon, African journalists to focus on these areas rather than, focus on these narratives that are dominating the news in Europe. I don't think the state would find that necessarily bad, because it will, help shape policy that ultimately, will help them sort of save their populations, and they will inevitably take credit for that.
I would imagine at a time like this is an opportunity for media across the continent. Often we compete, but perhaps this is a chance to work together to get a better picture of what's happening on our continent in each other's countries.
That's inevitable, Peter, and I think that's a very good point. I think it makes that absolutely necessary. It's normally quite unhelpful that if you want to read about South Africa, if you are in Kenya, you read about South Africa by looking at the Guardian in the UK, rather than a South African newspaper, or indeed learning about the country from neighboring countries. With our resource limitations and our experiences, peculiar experiences rather, as part of the African continent, I think it makes it absolutely necessary, if not inevitable, that we've got to collaborate, across the continent. And it might be that, fate will force African journalism to do that. I mean, beyond the COVID-19, I think a number of media organizations are going to struggle. So, these cross-country networks and collaborations will become inevitable.
How well do you think we've done in terms of education? Because, we're competing against fake news, and also on a continent where superstition, culture, and all these kinds of things also play into issues, that we have to be able to make sure that people are safe and have sound knowledge, and perhaps not just believing stuff that's kind of just being thrown out there.
Yeah, I don't think we've done that very well. And I would argue that, we need to strengthen, the community media, the local media. I think our mainstream media has been quite metropolitan, very elite, in its focus. It tends to focus on those who are probably able to, discriminate sort of information with very little regard to the margins. And I think it's upon us now to, reflect on what's missing. And I think what's missing is to strengthen, community media, or at least, ensure, that the margins are included, in the narrative, through, a range of measures, really. Because I think that is probably one of the biggest headaches that we are going to have with this particular virus. People are not particularly well informed, and they are likely to become victims of what others have called sort of infodemic, which is quite tragic, really.
All right, and perhaps to wrap this up, what would you say are the most important questions that African media should be asking itself as we navigate this period of time?
To inform our populations about this epidemic, but equally whether we are doing our role in informing a government appropriately to shape or come up with a constructive policy that speaks to our very unique experiences as a continent without necessarily reproducing sort of narratives that work for Europe and the United States.
All right. Prof. Ogola, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for your insights about African media and coverage of COVID-19 and perhaps areas we can improve and areas that we're doing well. Thanks so much indeed for your time. All right, now, in other news regarding journalists and the media in general, a local Pakistan court this Thursday overturned the death sentence and murder convictions of 4 men believed to have been involved in the killing of US journalist Daniel Pearl in 2002. Now, the men have been in prison for 18 years, with 3 serving life sentences, and the 4th, Ahmad Omar Saeed Sheikh, a British national, awaiting execution on a death sentence.
A Pakistani court has commuted the death sentence of the main person accused of murdering Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl. Pearl was investigating militants in Karachi after the September 11th attacks, when he was kidnapped in January 2002. A video of his murder emerged weeks later. He was beheaded. British-born Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh was sentenced to death that same year. But the court ruled on Thursday his role in the murder wasn't proven and gave him 7 years for the kidnapping. Sheikh Omar has already spent 18 years in jail awaiting the outcome of an appeal, so he's likely to walk free in the coming days. 3 co-accused were acquitted. A prosecutor is expected to file a new appeal, but the 4 men are likely to be released pending the outcome, unless a Supreme Court order stops that happening. Sheikh Omar enjoyed a privileged upbringing in the UK before attending the London School of Economics. He was also arrested in India in the 90s for his involvement in kidnapping Western tourists. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the accused mastermind of the September 11th attacks, was also allegedly involved in Pearl's killing.
So, despite the court's decision to overturn the death sentence and murder convictions, it's believed that Pakistan officials are refusing to release the men, with the Sindh provincial government's Home Department issuing an order to arrest and detain the 4 before they were released from prison. One official expressed concern that if the men are released, they may act against the interest of the country. Now, let's go into our news archives now, and today we take you back to the 2nd of April 2018, when we learned of the passing of struggle icon Winnie Madikizela Mandela, affectionately known as the Mother of the Nation. Madikizela Mandela died at the Mill Park Hospital in Johannesburg after a long illness. This is how the SABC covered the story then.
Winnie Madikizela Mandela, a struggle icon who has risen as many times as she has fallen. Renowned for her being gutsy, she has tasted prison, punishment and harassment at the hands of the apartheid police, all for standing up against apartheid. Often referred to as the Mother of the Nation, Winnie earned this title because not only was she strongly opposed to the apartheid regime, but she was also able to give to those less fortunate than her, despite the many challenges she faced. She has lived the life of a widow who struggled to raise her children single-handedly, while her former husband, the late President Nelson Mandela, was imprisoned. She has soldiered on as a political activist throughout the decades, sometimes rising and sometimes falling. She was the first black medical social worker at Baragwanath Hospital and is currently a member of the ANC National Executive after being absent from politics for years, following her convictions on Medat Stompie Moeketsi 1998 and fraud in 2003. She and Mandela divorced after he became the president in 1994, having separated 2 years prior to Mandela's presidency. Madikizela Mandela was never the first lady of South Africa, although she was still married to Mandela at the time he became president in May 1994. Their divorce was finalized on the 19th of March 1996. Lately, her health was deteriorating and she was in and out of hospital. Prior to going to the clinic, she was uncomfortable and complaining of loss of appetite, and one of her legs was painful. Upon admission, it was discovered that she had an infection that had affected her kidneys. She underwent a number of operations, and recently she was home and had honored a number of visits.
I am confident that we will lead this South Africa to victory.
Lehana Tsotetsi, SABC News.
Thank you.
It feels like just the other day. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll start talking to our international editors and see how the media is handling COVID-19 and other stories during this time. Right, welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor, and we now go to Namibia, and this is where we bring you our regular feature where we talk to one of our international editors, and today we're joined by Isaac Hamata, who's the former CEO of the Namibia Press Agency. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Great to talk to you. And I just, let me start perhaps by asking how the situation is in Namibia. I believe that you are also in lockdown. How long has it been?
Good morning, Peter, and good morning to all the SABC News viewers. We have been on lockdown from the 17th of March. That means we are now day 9. Just a day behind South Africa, which also declared the full lockdown. But Namibia's lockdown is only partial. It is 2 regions. It's the Khomas region and it's the Erongo region. Now, in South Africa, you would have provinces while we have regions in Namibia. So 2 of those regions, which initially were suspected to be the ones where the COVID virus infected people were, the state has declared a lockdown in those 2 areas. But what we hear now is that during the week, there will be they will declare a full lockdown of the entire country, and we have 14 regions in Namibia. So we're expecting an announcement during the week on that.
Is the airports and borders, are they still open? People coming in and out of the country?
No, when the head of state declared a state of emergency a couple of weeks ago, we suspended all travel in and out, social, economic, commercial, whatever, in and out of the country. Initially, it was only Dubai, Ethiopia, and Germany, but then it was extended to a full-scale restriction of air travel in and out of the country. So as we speak, there is no airline coming in or out. There may be exceptional cases of evacuation in and out of the country, but as far as commercial is concerned, that has been restricted in terms of the state of emergency.
How good have people been in terms of compliance and social distancing?
Look, it's a mixed bag, Peter. There are some areas where you really cannot enforce social distancing. By nature of the way people live, it's impossible to really enforce social distancing. People stay in shacks, 10 or more people in one shack, they are cramped. Those people cannot really comply to social distancing measures that have been put in place. The only thing you can really tell them is to really keep hygiene, keep sanitizing, keep washing your hands, keep clean, keep safe. That's the only message you can really tell those people. In terms of social distancing, from that perspective, it will be difficult. But you would find in the more urban, more upmarket type of areas, there you would find the streets are clean, or rather, there are no people in the streets. Yeah. People in the supermarkets or the retail shops, they respect social distancing. They allow only 10 people in a shop at a time to acquire the essential goods that they need. And from that perspective, it has been going good. And government learns as they go, and they're trying to put in new measures to make sure that at the end of the day, the message hits home that it's for our own health, it's for our own safety. If this COVID affects more people than we anticipate, then you can imagine what catastrophe that will mean for the entire country.
All right. So what's your assessment about how the media in Namibia has been covering the COVID-19 pandemic?
The media has been covering it very well from a reporting point of view, from an educational point of view, from an analytical and a critic point of view, asking the questions that need to be asked. How are things going to work? And government, based on what the media has reported and asked, they've come back to clarify certain issues. What does lockdown mean? What does quarantine mean? What does isolation mean? So by introspecting, by asking this type of questions, incisive questions, the government has been able to also self-reflect and maybe also sat down and said, listen, some of these things won't work the way we want them to work. Let us address them in a different manner. And that's why they've come up, for instance, looking at, let me look at the media. Initially, the media was not regarded as an essential service. But the media made a representation to the minister responsible for media affairs in government, and he has come out to say, no, because of the essential role of media, they cannot be excluded from an essential service category. And therefore, media is now allowed to move freely to report wherever it is that they want to be.
How well are they doing in terms of educating citizens about, the things to do, precautions to take, and also understanding the nature of this COVID-19?
I think the media has been doing very well. We must credit the media for doing their part. And this is not a commercial thing. This is a thing where the media people are Namibians, or they are human beings who are also able to be affected by COVID. So they cannot stand at the periphery and say this doesn't affect us. And therefore, they have taken a very central role to educate. I'm just looking at the number of newspapers here. They have a dedicated page where they explain some of these things, how transmissions happen, how you can keep safe, what social distancing means, and all of those things. So the media has really been doing their part in terms of reporting and educating Namibians on what this COVID is about.
All right, I know that most newspapers here in South Africa and other parts of the continent, the COVID-19 really been taking most of the headlines. Has that been the same for you? Let's look at today's papers, for example. Is the front pages all about COVID-19?
No, just a correction, Peter. Yeah. We don't have Saturday and Sunday papers.
Right.
We report from Monday to Friday.
Right.
I'm looking at Friday's papers. All of them, without fail, the headlines are about COVID. Differently reported, of course, but everyone speaks about COVID. The other one speaks about a tape that somebody has designed in Namibia. Other people are talking about social grants that are compounding social distancing in the country. And as you maybe would have heard, government has announced an 8.1 billion stimulus package. One newspaper is just breaking that down. How will it work? Another one says 30,000 tourism jobs in jeopardy because of COVID. So, and then another one says unions reject proposed wage cuts because the minister has said if this thing continues, we may be going into a wage cut situation where government people are supposed to forgo 20 or 40% of their salaries. Wow. The unions are rejecting that. So there's a wide balance of how media has reported on this, and it gives people a perspective of the different angles and things that are emanating from this COVID virus.
All right, Isaac, we're going to leave it there, but thanks so much indeed for joining us. That's Isaac Hamatos, the former CEO of the Namibia Press Agency, talking to us about how the media has been covering COVID-19 in his country. Now, according to the NGO Reporters Without Borders, there's Ali Muhammad Bello, a reporter for the state-owned Tele Chad, his cameraman Abakar Muhammad Said and their driver were assaulted and detained by members of the police mobile intervention unit in N'Djamena, the capital of Chad. This whilst covering the enforcement of measures taken by government to combat the COVID-19 epidemic on the 26th of March. According to a statement issued by the Union of Chadian Journalists, the journalists were interrogated for 3 hours at a police station before finally being released. All right, now let's take a look at this morning's newspaper headlines, and we're joined via Skype or maybe on the line by Director at Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird. William, thanks so much for joining us. Welcome. And how is the lockdown playing out for you?
Good morning, Peter. Good morning.
Hello, William, can you hear me? All right, okay, it looks like we're going to have to try and call him back. We're getting some feedback there, so he's going to help us look at some of the newspaper headlines. And just looking at them earlier on, of course, most of them all carrying different kinds of stories about COVID-19. The Sunday Times reporting about the picture on the ground, perhaps we don't really know just how things are. Experts are warning that we are probably understating the situation. Well, mass testing has begun, has been rolled out, starting with a couple of hotspot areas. And we're going to see perhaps by next week just how big the situation is in the country. And from then, we'll start to be able to map where the vulnerable spots are, and these interventions then can roll out. So that's one thing that we're hoping we'll be able to get more information on as this new map starts to build with all this testing. Well, let's try again to speak to William Bird. Hello, William, can you hear me? Hello, William? Hello, William Bird. All right, we're struggling. We're going to carry on trying to get hold of William Bird on the line. He's the director at Media Monitoring Africa. And I was just saying, and perhaps we can put up some of those newspapers now, actually, as we speak. The City Press has been carrying a story, and that one relates to the Minister of Police, Bheki Cele, who's been warning against fake news. And he says that he's pulling no punches when it comes to alcohol prohibition. And he says that he's hoping that this can carry on even after. And in fact, there's a story doing the rounds at the moment now. There was a young person in Pretoria, we believe, who on social media rolled out some videos mocking and swearing about the COVID-19 measures. Well, he has been arrested. He's going to be appearing in court on Monday, I believe. And so this government is hoping will serve as a lesson to people. Don't spread fake news. You can get a jail term now. We'll have a little bit more on that story in our programs coming up. But let's see if we can get William Bird again. Is he there? William? All right, okay, so he's not there. But let's take a look at the Sunday Independent. And the Sunday Independent, they're carrying a story now of these SMMEs. And it looks as if that it's not very clear who is going to benefit from these packages, these financial rescue packages. How small must you be, and how big is too big in terms of getting some assistance and some help from government? And so the SMME sector is saying that this 21-day lockdown has been a massacre for them so far, and that they're fearful that some of these politically connected entrepreneurs are going to be helped and to be getting assistance in terms of these packages. So big concern for SMMEs, and sadly we're probably going to see some of these companies disappearing. All right, let's try William again. Third time lucky, who knows, we might be able to hear him this time. William, can you hear us?
Good morning, Peter. Yes, I can hear you. I hope you can hear me now.
Great to see your face. All right, so you've been having a chance to sort of mull over the papers this morning, and I just wonder which paper first has grabbed your attention?
So I've only, unfortunately, been able to get a small selection of them because, you know, it's delivery issues. Yes. Sometimes you don't always get all of them.
Okay.
So the ones, I've been looking through, of course, the Sunday Times.
Yeah.
I looked through the Sunday World and the Sunday Independent. Obviously, coronavirus is the pretty much the big and only story there. So I think that what we have been seeing, which I think is really positive, is quite a lot of stories looking at and unpacking how ordinary people are dealing with this lockdown, and I think that that's quite an interesting angle. When we tended to only hear from some of the experts, and over the last weeks, certainly, of the lockdown, we've been seeing a concerted efforts by media to really get out into different areas and places and hear what ordinary people's experience are like.
Let's talk about that then. The Sunday World, I think in particular, that also grabbed my attention, and I hope they can put up the picture now. But it talks about corona hitting the shacklands, and social distancing is nigh impossible when you're living in cramped conditions such as these.
Yes, of course, and I mean, I think that's one of the clearest challenges that we have, is that this idea that everyone can social distance within their homes is just not applicable in our context. And I think we need to be finding other ways that actually we can do what we can in those areas that can help prevent the spread of the virus. So certainly some of the ideas around masks, perhaps, and that kind of thing are necessary. But yeah, once it's obviously in informal settlements, I'm not sure how they're going to try and prevent its spread, especially when people don't have access to even the basic necessities of clean running water and access to soap.
All right, so William, unfortunately we've run out of time. It took us a while to finally get hold of you, but we'll certainly have you on the program again in the very near future. But thanks so much indeed for your insights and your time, as you're always willing to give us. All right, that's where we're going to say goodbye. Thanks so much indeed for watching the show, Media Monitor, this week. Join us again next week at the same time. I know it's day 10 of 21, a lot still to go, but you know what, stay safe, it's not worth it. And also this thing of putting videos and media out there, fake news, it's not funny, and this is a very adult problem. Grow up and please, let's do right by our country. Have a good week, everybody. Bye-bye.